This is the Motherlands podcast. The intention of this podcast is to provide evidence-based information through honest conversations on fertility, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and beyond by bridging together the two worlds of allopathic medicine and holistic practices to improve the reproductive health outcomes of women. I am your host, Keely Semler. Hi, welcome back to Motherlands. I hope you had a beautiful summer. Thank you for being patient with me in letting me take space and slow down and enjoy my summer as well. I had my mom visit this summer and we planted this really sweet garden in our backyard. We're growing tomatoes and onions and scallions and kale, which was already there from the people that lived in our home before us, and lots of flowers and blue anise sage, which the hummingbirds love. And it was just so nice to be able to spend time with family and slow down a little bit, although my summer was pretty packed with births, which was also very nice. The first guest we have today is Kimberly Johnson. Some of you might be familiar with her and her work. She, I think, is a luminary when it comes to understanding women's bodies and female health. She wrote The Fourth Trimester, which I think is pretty much a staple now in most people's preparation of birth and particularly postpartum. And in this episode, we talk about how that book has aged, because that book has been out for a long time now, and just how the information she shares in that book is still so relevant, and in some ways it's timeless and invaluable information, and still pretty much unrecognized by our society. So if you've never read The Fourth Trimester and you are preparing to give birth sometime in the future, I highly suggest picking up a copy. We also talk about pelvic floor wellness, and it's actually an area that I first learned about Kimberly. She used to have, I believe she calls it a dome in Southern California, where she used to see clients and do pelvic mapping and helping women understand their pelvic floor. It is different than going to see a pelvic floor therapist. It's not so clinical or medical. It's more exploratory, somatic. Overall, it's amazing chatting with her. We also talk about women's health and how anything related to being a woman is sort of prescriptive right now, especially online. It makes it seem like women's problems are just so easy to solve. Like, oh, you're not sleeping, take this supplement. And we're more complex than that. And I just really like how she articulates that. And just in general, her philosophy of teaching is amazing because she's been around for a while. For a long time, I think her focus was on postpartum and the early months and years that follow birth. And she openly shares how she is changing as a person. And so therefore, her work is changing. What a concept that is now generally understood and accepted by our culture, but just a reminder that as we grow and change and shift, so does our work. So this is a really amazing episode for anyone that is a woman or anyone that wants to support a woman. I think you'll get a lot from it. She also shares about her new program called Mother Circle, and you can find out more information in the show notes. Okay, we'll get started with this episode. And one final note is, if you know someone that works for a company or a brand that might be interested in supporting the Motherlands podcast, I would love to talk to them. You can send me an email, hello@keelysemler.com. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys again soon. It would be really lovely just to kind of jump right in and get to ask you some questions about what led you into your offerings working with women. And I've listened to you on many podcasts, and I think that you are such a visionary in how you provide practical guidance and support for women of all walks of life. So forgive me if I'm being a little personal or too forward, but I was hoping if you wouldn't mind sharing perhaps how your upbringing or how your childhood or how you were raised may have informed how you show up in your work with women, whatever you feel comfortable with sharing.
Yeah, it's not always easy to make those direct connections. Many people in my life have asked me if I grew up in an ashram because I spent most of my 20s either in India or trying to get to India and doing a lot of yoga and chanting a lot of Sanskrit. And I absolutely did not grow up in an ashram. My parents are Republicans, and I grew up in a place called Rancho Santa Fe, which is sort of the Greenwich of San Diego. So yeah, I grew up in a upper middle class family and socially liberal family, kind of typical California Republican, like fiscally conservative, socially liberal. I've always had a soft spot for the underdog. I've loved movies. My favorite movies are always like the hurricane, the person who comes from the bottom who makes it to the top. And then there's other people that, help them out. And Dirty Dancing's like my all-time favorite movie, really related to Baby, really was into Johnny. Stayed for a double feature, watched it twice in a row when I was like 15. I think for whatever reason, I always knew that the way that I was growing up wasn't typical, that I was very curious to see what was happening outside the bubble that I lived in. And I was very dedicated to trying to figure out what I could do with my privilege, which I was pretty clear that I had. If I had to say why that is, the only thing I could really tie it to is that I skipped a grade. So I went from first grade into a third, fourth combination. So I was 6 and I went into a classroom with 8 and 9-year-olds. And at that time, it really separated my ability to be social from my ability to access my intellect. So I did just fine intellectually in those advanced classes. And I was even sent up to higher, like 5th grade math. And I kept getting sent beyond my social group. But that made it very hard for me to relate socially. So I think I already felt a bit of a black sheep. And then also I have bright red hair. It's a little less bright now that I'm 50, but it was copper. I was always teased for having, it wasn't a cool thing when I was a kid. Like now I think it's kind of cool to be ginger and have freckles, and people even tattoo freckles on. But when I was a kid, it was like all kinds of nicknames for that. Maybe those things are reasons why I always was paying attention to people who lived differently than the way that I did. But, I feel like I've always been an activist, but now I'm really reconsidering that word, and I'm really reconsidering. I think I used to feel that everyone should be an activist, and now I'm not so sure about that. And I'm not so sure what I think activism really means anymore. But when I was an undergraduate, I was a social policy major, and I was spending a lot of time in the African American Studies department. I specialized in urban education. I taught 4th grade for a year. So I've always been a teacher. I've always believed in the power of education. And so for people who don't know me, I do hands-on, hands-in body work. Some people have called me a vagina practor because when there's things wrong, whether it's post-birth or post-gynecological surgery or sexual boundary ruptures, I work with them in a somatic way, but with my hands as well. That work is radical. It's technically illegal on some level because I'm not a physical therapist or a doctor or an acupuncturist or the people who have technical scope to do that work. So I pushed a lot of boundaries in terms of where I think systems need to go and where I think responsibility really lies.
I think that's how I first heard about your work, was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I had a couple friends that turned into clients that said they came down and saw you in a yurt somewhere, and you were doing sort of internal evaluations and exams. And at the time, I was in graduate school at Keck School of Medicine, and I remember being like, I've never heard of that before. That sounds really, really interesting to me. Can you talk a little bit about what that work looks like are you still offering that, or you've stepped away from that?
I don't do as much as I used to do. Some people seem to find their way to me, and when people have things that I feel like are straightforward but haven't been able to be helped by anyone else, then I'll usually do the work. And when I'm training people to do the work, then we bring in people who have things they need help with. And then I do demo sessions and I train other people to do the work. So you use the word exam, which is totally normal because you come from a medical context, but it's important for me to say, like, my background, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm a rolfer, so I do structural body work, I work with fascia. I'm a sexological body work, which gives me scope in California to touch pelvises, and I'm a somatic experiencing trauma resolution practitioner, and I was a birth doula for some time. And besides that, I'm an author and a teacher. So the way I spend most of my time these days is writing books and teaching people about the female nervous system and how to perceive our own female nervous system, not necessarily, although I do have the technical chops, I'm not a neuroscientist. I've never given anyone a vaginal exam. So if you think about any kind of body work, massage or rolfing or craniosacral work, the genitals are not part of that. If you think about yoga, maybe if you're in like a specific tantra school, then it's mostly genital or genital heart. But as far as a typical yoga class, you're not going to hear any genital language. If you do, it's going to be something fairly abstract, like your pelvic floor. That's kind of a neutral thing that everybody has a pelvic floor. After I became a mom, it really became very glaring to me. Wow, my internal pelvic space is significantly altered. There's a part of that space that can only be contacted internally. Certain external rotators, the deep six, obturator, internus, you can't really get to it externally. A lot of people came to me with tailbone injuries, but no one had ever done anal work with them. And it was the anal work that really fixed their tailbone injury. So in rolfing, we get trained to work in the mouth and the nose. But because of a lot of obvious reasons about legality and ethics and, all kinds of other things, the genitals are just pushed aside, and it becomes kind of a black hole where you just like, don't talk about it, don't touch it, don't work with it. Then come gynecological health, and there's a lot of information in the vulva and in the vaginal tissue, and it happens to be incredibly malleable, incredibly shape-shifting, because that's its function. So when we do pay attention to it, just like the sacrum as a bony landmark is the keystone of the body, the vaginal space, which is really much more than a tunnel, it's like a very vast landscape, has a lot of information in it. And it holds a lot of information, both personally and ancestrally. So when you have witnessing touch that's not medical, it's not prescriptive. So that's why I distinguish, like, I don't do exams. That's outside of my purview. I map the area with the person and I tell them what they're feeling. So most people know what a cervix is, sort of, and they might be able to identify it on a diagram. But if you said, where is your cervix? That might be more challenging for them to say, like, I wonder how low it is towards my vaginal opening. How high is it to the left, to the right? Then when you add contact, that space becomes very vague. And for some people, there's dissociation. So there's numbness, there's an absence of sensation and a kind of checkout of I have no idea. And then for some people, it's just specific tissue, right? Some people have had tissue removed, all kinds of things. So knowing where your cervix is in present time is a different thing than knowing what a cervix is or knowing where it should be or overlaying a template onto your own structure. My work is really about bringing awareness to the tissue and then letting the tissue talk, because the tissue itself holds memory. That sometimes if you talk to someone and you say, like, tell me about your birth experience, for a lot of women, they've already gone over and over and over it. They know, oh, I feel betrayed by my husband when he didn't defend me and I said I didn't want an epidural, and then the midwife sucked because she did this. And they have sort of the sequential chronological memory, and they have maybe the narrative structure that they've put in place, but they don't have the underlying somatic completion that's necessary so that they can move on. And those memories aren't determining how their sex life is with their partner and how their next birth goes, or if they even feel like they know if they want to have another child based on being able to metabolize that earlier birth. So the hands-on work, people often come to me because now, I've been doing this since 2012 about, so 12 years or so. And now in this 12 years, yoni massage has gotten really popular. People say, oh yeah, you do pussy mapping or you do this. And I'm not always sure what they mean because I don't know what everybody's doing who's doing those different modalities. But what I know is that some people come to me because they think, okay, I just want to try this out. And I'm not responding to just what their mind and their words are telling me. I'm responding to their whole body. So just because someone says, I want you to map my pelvic floor, doesn't mean when they come to my space that that's what's going to happen, because I have to be sure that their body is actually ready for that. And for most women, the rupture happened because they weren't quite sure if it was okay, if their body was saying no, but their head was saying yes, that they could do that. Because in power dynamics with a doctor, your body could say no, but you know that they're going to retaliate against you if you say no to something. So then you say yes. So my work is really about harmonizing the layers of body language, vocal tone, facial expression, and helping someone understand like, oh, well, when you say this, this actually isn't what your body's telling me. Or when you say no, you're smiling. And so I can see how that's sending a different message, and you might be getting a different response from the outer world. So we have to do that work first before we get to internal work. So it's not like everybody who comes to my space, I'm just like putting on the gloves and like getting right in there. There's a lot of reparative work. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes I have a lot of dancers that come and they've had so much awareness and so much touch everywhere except for internally. And the internal work kind of puts that last piece together for them. So it's really dependent on the person, but it's a way of including this essential space outside of a shame context, outside of a medical context, and outside of sexual context.
Yeah. When I first heard about this work that you were doing, I thought about how amazing it would be to see how women who might have not gone through childbirth yet, how they might connect to that part of their body before going through childbirth and just having some awareness and connection to that part of their body. Have you worked with any clients that have come to you prior to becoming pregnant or going through birth who've wanted
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I've worked with pregnant women too, because I had a client once who was having intense nausea for 7 months of her pregnancy. And for some reason, she got it in her mind that she thought it would be a good idea to come see me. So we agreed. And when we got to the internal work, her vagina was so tight that basically my index finger couldn't even move into the vaginal space. And as we just stuck with it, I was like, what have you been doing? Like, what's contributing to this? Well, she was doing a lot of Pilates every day because she was teaching Pilates and she was doing Pilates. So through the course of the session, the vagina is a sphincter. So it can open really fast. It's just a context of how much safety there is, and then the muscles will release. Now, like with some muscles, if it's hypertonic, sometimes it would take some other characteristic as well. But essentially, it took one session, and once her vagina let go, she wasn't nauseous anymore for the rest of her pregnancy, because she was saying like, I wouldn't be able to give birth right now. And I was like, you're right. Because a lot of people would just say, no, just believe in yourself. Just do the affirmations, do hypnobirthing. Like, it's possible for any woman to do this. How could women, for the millennials, women have been doing this however long. And it was like, no, your body is nauseous and resistant because it's telling you it needs support, because you absolutely would not have pushed a baby out of this vagina. There's no way. It was completely blocked. So once it was open, then her body could let go of the nausea because there was no need to signal danger to her, because there was a pathway that was open. And she also recognized herself, like, I'm not going to do any more Pilates for the rest of my pregnancy. Like, she made that connection herself. So I did something called a birth rehearsal, because I used to live in Brazil. And in Brazil, it's a 98% cesarean rate. And there's a lot of things that people say to themselves that are reasons why they think a cesarean is safer. And one of them is, I don't have the passageway, não tenho passagem. And so I realized, well, if I could show them that they do, then they could know ahead of time in a very visceral way, and also to feel that those tissues can expand and go back to their shape, because there's an unconscious or conscious fear that it's going to stretch and not go back. And so that's when I started doing the birth rehearsals, is like helping people stretch. And I know it's controversial, perineal stretching. And
that was my next question, is what do you think about that?
It's controversial only because imagine a lay person trying to do it. It's like, you have to know what you're doing. And I'm not saying that a lay person can't learn, but most of the time people aren't putting enough pressure. They're not pressing in the right ways. And it's hard to do something that's really uncomfortable to yourself. Or people are like, I'll ask my partner, but like, partners don't want to hurt you. And it would be the rare person who has like hands-on chops to feel what's really happening in the tissues. So I don't feel that there's really accurate research. And I also don't think that it's imperative, like everybody has to do perineal stretching. I don't think it's like that. But it can be very useful, especially for people who are horseback riders, yoga practitioners, Pilates practitioners, bar method, anything where you're using a ton of adductor and midline strength. Because the information out there about prenatal health is really for people who are mostly sedentary. Like when it's like prenatal yoga, that's good for you. Well, if you've already been doing tons of yoga and you're already hypermobile, then it's a terrible idea to do prenatal yoga and do quote unquote hip openers. You could just call them pelvic destabilizers. But if you are not a person who's ever done yoga and you haven't done much stretching and you spent most of your life sitting, then yes, that's a fabulous idea to do somewhat quote unquote hip openers, Baddha Konasana, Upavishta Konasana, So it's context dependent. And there tends to be this idea that, well, any exercise is better than no exercise. That could be true sometimes, but you can ask any midwife. They get concerned about the women who exercise a ton and who are doing a lot of midline engagement because the perineum is just tight. It's hyper engaged and it needs manual pressure to let go generally, not for everyone, not all the time. And there's nutritional factors and there's all age factors, all kinds of factors. But in general, that's true. And then I work with tons of people who aren't moms. Most people have had unwanted touch in their pelvis, and most people know that they need some kind of support. Because if the ruptures have happened through touch, oftentimes you need touch to help heal the rupture.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the intelligence of tissue as it relates to scar tissue?
Yeah. So I'm kind of a scar tissue specialist. I founded a school called the Scar Tissue Remediation Education and Management School with my mentor, Ellen Heed. And I'm not a part of that school anymore, but the school continues. There's a difference between scar tissue and adhesions. If you have a cut, you need scarring. If you tear, there needs to be a scar there, whether it's stitched or not. However, in an inflammatory environment, scars will proliferate. And collagenous tissue and elastinous tissue scar differently. Some scars act like infections, like keloid scarring acts like an infection. I just worked with someone the other day that's 34 years post-cesarean and her scar is still inflamed and still weeps sometimes. Wow. So there's not enough attention paid to scar tissue. And with almost anyone who comes to me who has scarring, as a practitioner, it's the most practical way to start because the scar has its own memory. There's so many people who've had cesareans and they're either disgusted by their own scar, they don't want to touch it, they don't want to look at it. And so there's a cutoff at that level. There's either an epidural level cutoff or there's a scar level cutoff between where they can take their consciousness. Just having them place their own hands on their scar and breathe into it oftentimes brings up a lot of either emotion or sensation or movement. And there's a real opportunity to heal that. And the scar will dissolve. So the scar itself is functional, but all of the adhesions and lumps and bumps and pain and inflammation and pulling in other directions. Like I had somebody who was having crippling pain after every orgasm because her cesarean scar tissue was adhered to her psoas. So when she would orgasm, it would tighten her psoas and she would just be doubled over in pain. And all the doctors said, oh, no, that's not related. And then she thought I was a wizard. And I'm like, you told me exactly what's happening. And I just disadhered the thing that was adhered. It wasn't really magic, but because it was discounted so much by the healthcare practitioners, it seemed like a magical thing. So scar tissue is kind of treasure trove of opportunity because it's a physical artifact of the trauma. Even if you wanted it, even if you needed it, all those things, a scar is still a trauma to the body. To the extent to which there's adhesions, usually there's stored emotion, stored nervous system patterns that need to happen. And people are kind of used to getting body work and then being like, you're the professional, you do your thing, and I'm just going to try to be as relaxed as I possibly can. And my work really requires, because a lot of times it's like, I'm holding your pelvis and you're trying to relax your legs, but they actually are trying to clench. Mm-hmm. So now you're going to need to clench your legs and let your legs do what they want to do so that I can understand what's happening in the tissue. And a lot of times it's like, oh, there was a really mean doctor on this side and my leg wants to kick him. And at the time I couldn't kick him. And oh my God, I can't believe I would never kick a doctor. And I'm like, yeah, but maybe you would, maybe if you were in your most animal empowered self and you weren't worried about retaliation or you weren't under anesthetic, maybe you would. But now your body needs a chance to do that thing that it couldn't do in the moment. Or if it's tremoring, a lot of people were told they shouldn't shake. And they're coming down off of anesthesia and their body would normally shake, and everyone around them is doing everything possible to stop the shaking. And the shaking is still in the system, manifesting as anxiety, manifesting as grief, manifesting as all different things. So we give space for those physical experiences to happen.
I'm so curious what your thoughts are around in birth when someone is pushing. I just met with a client and there were a lot of things that were going on in the birth, but afterwards she told me, is something wrong with me? I didn't feel any urge to push my baby out the whole time. Baby was crowning and I still did not feel any urge to push. And she asked me if that was normal. And I said, I've definitely encountered births before where the client did not feel an urge to push. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But I did suggest maybe going to see someone that can do some internal work to help her create some sort of connection with that part of her body, those muscles, those tissues.
Did she need to push?
I mean, does anyone need to push if a baby's crowning and the baby's fine? Not necessarily, but giving birth in the hospital, I think there was a bit of wanting the baby out, even though mom was fine and baby was fine.
The baby was born, right?
Yeah, the baby was born. Yeah.
Without pushing.
Yeah.
Then there's no problem to solve. Most birth education class tells everybody not to push. And then I've barely been in a birth in a hospital or at home where at some point the practitioners aren't telling the person to push. It's very confusing because
that's kind of what I'm getting at is most people are taught don't push or you're going to feel an urge to push. And if that doesn't occur, suddenly you think, is there something wrong with me?
I mean, there's definitely births where I've been to where it's absolutely necessary that the person pushes. The baby's at a high station, there's all kinds of reasons. And there's people who have the fetal ejection reflex. I'd say that's pretty rare these days, but it's possible.
Why do you think that's rare? Do you think people are just not patient enough for baby to come down low enough in the pelvis? Or why do you think it's rare for people not to experience the fetal ejection reflex?
It's a very complex question, but one of the reasons is because our baseline lives are so out of connection with a nervous system that's in touch with natural rhythms. So most of us don't live on farms. Most of us have never seen a baby born or a baby animal born before we're giving birth. But secondarily, I mean, how many people have female ejaculation? It's like not very common. Why is that? Well, part of it because people have never heard of it. Part of it because it's a different kind of an out of control sensation that most people aren't used to allowing to happen, or it's happened once and then they've inhibited it because they weren't sure what was going on. Yeah, I mean, I'm not as radical as some people that insist that like that's something that would happen for every birth if things were just better and women were healthier and we were like giving birth in the ocean, then every time would be the fetal ejection reflex. I don't think so. And I also know people who have had the fetal ejection reflex and their body is spasmed open or it's torn their cervix because it was so fast, or there's not like a magic solution. But certainly if you're not free to move and you're in a neocortical management functioning in your birth environment, it's much less likely that you would have a reflex like the fetal ejection reflex.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't hear about many unencumbered births these days where people feel really safe in their environment.
Mm. What were your observations being a birth doula? I imagine that was a little while ago.
Yeah, I think maybe my last birth was 5 years ago, something like that. Somebody asked me the other day about that last one, and then I realized, oh yeah, that's why that was the last one. I feel like many people hire doulas these days the same way that they decide whether or not they want an epidural or what kind of crib they want. And it's on their checklist of how to have a good birth. But I think we all know that for a doula to really do her job, there has to be a willingness to walk through the fire. And a doula can't have your baby for you. And I really wanted a lot more for my clients than they wanted for themselves for the majority of the time. So
what an incredible conclusion that is.
Yeah, I felt like I was an accomplice to something by the end of like, oh, I'm just playing into the system. And everyone would say, oh, no, but their birth is like a little bit better because you're there. And I'm like, yeah, but that incremental better is not better for me, is not better for my soul and my system, because I saw some horrendous things that my clients went along with in spite of my advice and a lot of education up to that point and all kinds of things. So I didn't think I could be effective in that space anymore. And I'm also a single mom, so doing all-nighters, and I don't really have a plan B in terms of where's my daughter going to go when I'm at a birth. But mostly it was just realizing that what I set out to do in that space, I didn't think I could do effectively, that I could make more better change working differently and helping birth doulas understand their own nervous systems, because so many people become birth doulas because of their own birth traumas, their own pelvic traumas, their own history, and they want to help. And it's a beautiful thing to want to serve people and to help. But if you're bringing that into the birth space, then you got to know what your own nervous system is communicating in the space.
Right. Yeah. When I was thinking of things I wanted to ask you, something really came forward to me, and it's about this idea that, especially in online spaces like social media, women's health, or literally anything related to being a woman now, there's sort of this prescriptive and somewhat accusatory tone for almost any single ailment of like the human body. Like, take this supplement and then you won't have your problem, or take this course and then suddenly you'll be this embodied person, or buy this product, or hire a doula, or whatever it is. And recently I saw a post online from a pretty prominent account of an expert on women's health who claims that prolapse is a problem far before you become pregnant or have your baby. And it was the way that she was delivering the information. I think she had a good intention, but how it read was like, oh, if you have prolapse, like, sorry, you could have dealt with it before you got pregnant, and now you have this long-term problem, and it's a fascial problem. And if you had only paid attention to your fascia, then maybe you wouldn't have prolapse. I'm just wondering if you could speak to sort of the prescriptive and sort of accusatory tone that I think a lot of women, a lot of mothers are sort of participating and experiencing online. And I think a lot of women are confused about their health and the messaging. It's not uplifting or confidence inducing in any way. Can you speak a little bit about that?
That's interesting. Well, I'm in menopause right now, and I am leading a 4-series discussion basically called the Menopause Mysteries. I kind of got pushed off the cliff to doing it because what I was seeing out there just felt so off to me about every single thing having either a supplement to go with it that's going to solve your problem. The algorithms that I was getting fed were so disheartening. Just like everything was like, just biohack your life, basically. Biohack your life stage. If you just do this and do that and do this, then you're not going to experience these things. I guess that's what you're saying, like that you could just do better. If you were just doing better, then you wouldn't experience the symptoms.
Or you wouldn't
that you're
have
having.
these problems, and your life would be, you'd be so much healthier, like as if it's a linear problem to solve, you know?
Yeah, I mean, for prolapse specifically, I did a podcast that's just about prolapse. I had a prolapse, and what the medical system says is that it's never something you can heal, it's only something that you can manage. But I did heal my own prolapse, and I have helped other people heal their own prolapse. Everything is so reactive that it's hard for me to say much because social media is a world in and of itself. It's almost as if it's happening in a parallel universe to reality. whatever topic that is, if that's the presidential election, if that's the war in Israel, if it's vaccines, it's like there's something that's happening there that's making people feel as if that's really the thing that's happening rather than the region itself that's affected or the person itself or herself, himself. And I don't understand why being authoritarian about things that's supposed to be anti-authoritarian, because ultimately this is the nervous system work that I teach, that many people are making enemies out of allies by the way that we're communicating, not just with our words, but with our nervous system. So it's perfectly possible that you have a prolapse during birth that you were not predisposed to, especially if you have a mechanical delivery. Now, that same person might say, well, that's also your fault because you should have had a free birth. If you really were empowered and you really would have chosen the right birth scenario, then you wouldn't have had a mechanical delivery. But that's all hindsight. And there are definitely things that we can do to make our tissue stronger, to set ourselves up for an empowering experience. But that doesn't mean that we have control over all of those things. Mm-hmm. And it's very scary to be out of control. Birth is an out of control experience. Menopause is an out of control experience. Postpartum is an out of control experience. Now, people go after those. They schedule ayahuasca ceremonies and they try to get psychedelic to quote unquote lose control. But you're still controlling that because you're still deciding when you're doing it. You're deciding where you're going. You're deciding how you want to eat beforehand. Whereas you can be overtaken by pregnancy. You can be overtaken by a birth scenario. And so I'm sad at the way that a lot of people are communicating about women's health, because it seems to me that it's just another iteration of authoritarianism. Now it's not a doctor that's telling you exactly how you should be and what you should do. Now it's a women's health expert that's shaming you into feeling like you didn't do enough or know enough or pay attention or be embodied enough before something quote unquote bad happened to you. To me, life is not about going through it and remaining pure, or that an absence of symptoms means that you're doing everything right. That's not been true in my own life. I've done a lot of things. I've never taken prescription medication, for instance. There's a lot of ways that I've lived in harmony with my body, and there's just the things that we come into life with, and we make mistakes and harm happens to us, and none of that means it was wrong. To me, that's still a puritanical reframe. It's still fundamentalism. And when I hear that tone that you're calling accusatory, to me, what rings underneath that is a fundamentalist attitude. And, we need all kinds of voices, but I'm also very disheartened to see that, people are like, yeah, you should worry about perimenopause when you're 35. You should start preparing. It's like the messaging is prepare for everything before it happens. So like get Botox before you get 11s, start worrying about your fertility before you even have a partner and have good sex. And like, it's all this like anxiety invoking, fear producing, and all of that stuff just self-reinforces. It all just makes the problems worse. So I'm in a period of evaluation myself of what is really helpful, because I used to think that educating people was helpful. And long before Instagram, I was making Facebook Lives. I was in the yurt it was a dome that you heard about. And I worked in this dome, and I would see 3 or 4 people a day usually. And then in the middle of sessions, I would go out and record a Facebook Live where I would talk about themes from the sessions. I wouldn't talk about the people or the sessions, but I'd say like, here's what's coming up in the session work today. Here's what I'm noticing. And that felt really cutting edge. Well, now, everybody is like, you just flip on your phone and there's somebody giving birth, and then there's a picture of a crowning baby, and then there's, a vulva portrait. And so I can't really say, oh yeah, more information is helping people. In fact, it seems there's more chaos and static than ever because people don't have discernment to know. And so then they hear this thing of like, yeah, you should have taken care of your fascia so that you don't get prolapse. And, you better, touch your own pussy every day if you really want to know yourself. And it's all like, well, is that the way that we're going to come into greater alignment? Do we need someone else telling us what to do? We need guides. I've had fantastic teachers. We definitely need guides. And maybe, some people, they're kicked off the edge towards making an action that they couldn't have otherwise made. It's out there a lot in the sexual space too, of like, if you're not having an orgasm a day, then you're just not doing right by yourself. And, get off your freaking antidepressants and get your crystal wand, because that's how you become a well-fucked woman, and it just is like,
how discouraging, and damaging can that be for someone? And how about girls? Like, how about young women,
I find that my daughter and I have a 16-year-old, and I find that her and her friends, it's like the millennials are the ones that are really in a bad way, but she's very oppositional to what she sees, and her take on sexuality and her friends' takes are very different than the pressure that I feel that the millennials have based on just how they evolved with social media. But, it could be discouraging, or it could be like sharpen your discernment and turn off your phone. Like, women, stop going to the phone for healthcare. Stop going to socials to find out about how you should raise your children, and maybe that's another thing that sounds harsh, but we all have to do it. It's like, after a certain point, I was like, okay, I'm going to research menopause. I've got like 20 books. I read them. I was like, these suck. These 2 are okay. Now it's time to turn that off and listen to myself. And from what I hear, the deeper wisdom of myself, we all know there's something that's within our reach that's not expensive that we could do that would make us feel a lot better. What is that thing? What do I have time for? What am I really going to stick with? And moving in that direction. So regardless of how people are acting on social media itself, we already know, creates poor body image, creates anxiety, in some cases makes people suicidal. We have to be responsible for that to ourselves.
Yeah, what a humbling reality, and something that I think most of my pregnant clients, I have to remind all the time. Hey, TikTok is not a real resource to get the most useful information for you in pregnancy, or Dr. Google is not going to be helpful to you in creating more confidence and trust in your body. But it's almost like this knee-jerk reaction people have. Like, I gotta know, let me go straight to Google because it's quick and dirty and easy, right?
Well, and if people take anything away from this conversation, it's a phrase called oppositional gaze. So I learned it in the late 90s, Patricia Hill Collins, Black feminist theory. It's about questioning, not in a hyper-vigilant, you can be, and you can be reactive, but we know that most of that stuff is in service of selling you something, whether it's that person selling you something that moment or selling you something later. Personally, I'm on Instagram. I run my business off of it. So I include myself. I am selling something on there. I would not be on Instagram if I weren't selling something, because it's not good for me. So I'm doing it because it's part of how I make a living. Do I think I'm mostly doing good work? Yes. Do I think that I'm providing something for free that's helpful? Yes. However, I'm still selling something. So anybody who's watching it should also know, sure, you're just deciding, do you like me? Do we resonate? Am I someone you'd want to learn from? But it is a sales tool for most people. We don't run ads in magazines anymore because nobody uses magazines. So it's how people get to know us and know what we're doing. You should know when you're looking at it that photos are photoshopped. And you should know that people are using old pictures of themselves. I don't do that. I use current pictures, and I always laugh because it's pretty obvious, because I look terrible in some of the videos and pictures, because I don't wait till I look good or put on makeup to record stuff, because that was one of my ethoses to myself, is I'm not going to just be this polished thing out there. And the same would go for mothering. I mean, there's great content on Instagram. One of my students and colleagues, Kate Pope, she's the wild nutritionist. She does amazing work on there, but she's also selling courses. Are the courses she's selling fantastic? Yes. Mama Baby Biome, get your kids' eczema cleared up. It works and it's helpful. So it's not that there's never good stuff out there. It's this, you have to know the dosage. And for me personally, I live alone with my 16-year-old. I love what I do. I love my work. Like a lot of people, I'm fairly isolated. I work in my home. I live in my home. I live in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. I'm sitting at my kitchen table right now. It's easy to be isolated. So it's also easy to pick up the phone, and it's easy to be going back and forth to see what's happening. And ultimately, it's not rewarding. So I'm switching a lot of my business that I can into in-person gatherings because I don't want to keep contributing to this online life that is not even remotely as satisfying or as challenging in some ways as encountering people body to body. But that's really what nervous system needs. And it's really what we need is gathering and closeness. So to the extent that people can, who are listening, the best thing you could do is just go to the park and be with other moms and other breastfeeding women. The best thing that you could do is be with other people, both at your same stage of life and at different stages of life, and do whatever you can to create that community. It's also why I moved from, now I'm teaching something called Mother Circle. It has its own website, mothercircle.com, and it's an 8-class arc of the unseen journey of motherhood. And it helps people have a context. And to me, it's sort of like people feel depressed because it is depressing to have a child and feel unsupported and also feel physically completely drastically altered without understanding how to put yourself back together. And my vision would be that these mother circles would be happening in so many places that doctors could say, okay, you're depressed, go try a mother circle, see what it's like to sit in circle in meaningful conversation, and then come back and we'll talk about the biochemical factors and the other factors. But we need education first about what's actually happening, what's happening archetypically, what's happening physiologically, what's happening sexually. So I'm training facilitators to be able to lead those circles so that women have that horizontal and communal care. It's a step away from outsourcing to the internet or outsourcing to father, doctor, God. Somebody else is going to have the answer for me. Because in women's health, yes, there's people who know a lot about it and can help you put your pieces together, but we are ever shifting landscapes. So here I knew so much about postpartum, and I've heard thousands of women tell me their stories, and I ended up at menopause with a ton of symptoms that I was completely surprised about having, that I didn't think would happen to me with everything that I knew about the pelvis and everything that I knew about the vulva and everything I knew generally about health. And I still got completely worked over and am getting worked over by it.
Well, it's been some time since you wrote your book, The Fourth Trimester, and it's a book that I think almost all my clients purchase. Has your perspective changed at all since you wrote it? Or is there anything new since writing it that you think should be considered going into postpartum? Or do you feel like you covered it all? It still remains true?
Yeah, there's things that that social media really wasn't a thing when I wrote the book. Facebook, somewhat, but Facebook was so tame compared to the speed of Instagram. Like, I don't even think I mentioned social media in the book. I don't recall at the moment, but I don't think so. There'd have to be a plan in place about the phone because it's not a good idea to breastfeed and scroll.
Or how about like all the tracking apps?
Same thing. All of these biohacking tips and aura rings and gadgets for heart rate variability, it's all people say, no, it's helping me be more embodied. No, it's not. It's helping you be less embodied. And all of those stats and all of those details are not taking you closer to yourself. It's distracting you. And it's telling you that you need something outside of yourself to be able to have that perception. You do need something outside of yourself. It's other people, not other technological gadgets. And usually it's fear that makes us do that. Like, I'm not going to be able to know this. I'm not sufficient enough. Well, maybe if I get this thing, then I will be. Well, maybe, if I have this extra thing, then I can be better or I won't feel as much. There's a lot, though. The world is a lot different than it was 7 years, but I still stand by what I said.
It's really timeless. I think it's an incredible book. But it is funny how, like, 7 years later, a lot of it still rings true. But yeah, the technology piece and how we interact with the world, and I think perhaps how some people feel so siloed and isolated is something to think about. Do you think you may write a book on menopause sometime?
I have a book deal right now, but it's not on menopause. I have a book that's due soon that's on women's soul journeys and sexual journeys and how those are often parallel paths. So it includes menopause and that phase of life, but it's not exclusive to that phase of life. I don't know. It's this thing where like I don't want to add to the garbage. And I'm not saying what I would write is garbage, but I'm absolutely so disheartened by what I see out there coming from people that normally I totally thought that I would be in alignment with. But a female life stage as a problem to solve, I just can't get down with it. A female life stage is a diagnosis. When I talked to a naturopath, he was like, "So you're in perimenopause." I'm like, yeah, dude, I know. That's why I'm here. Like, it was like he was telling me I had cancer,
Oh God.
got no hormones. I'm like thinking to myself, well, I'm standing up, so I've got to have some hormones. I mean, I took the point, but it was just everything is not pathology. And there's actually a lot of beauty in it. I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna, and I don't actually appreciate the books that are like, this is just second spring. It's not winter at all. It's only spring. It's rebirth. No, it is a death. It's a kind of death. It's a very hard thing to go from being fertile to non-fertile. It's a very hard thing to understand what is it to be female and not fertile. It's very devastating to watch yourself age very quickly. It's hard to know that certain things are done and finished and will never be. Those are very hard things to reckon with. And it's a part of life I'm lucky to be in. Like, I'm so grateful that I've lived long enough to come to this place. And it's a challenge. But why do we live in a culture where anything challenging is bad and we should automatically medicate it or solve it? Like, what is this teaching me? What is it asking of me? How do I need to move differently in the world so that what is coming to the surface is actually listened to and maybe even enhanced? And the same was with postpartum. So I don't know if I'll write a book on it, but I certainly feel passionate about it. And I feel that it's my responsibility now to live this phase. I'm not taking hormonal replacements. I'm not using external things to move through it. I've committed to doing this, even though everyone tells me it's impossible. And people who are against hormonal birth control are now telling me you have to take HRT. Like, it's like, this is the thing. I just can't see outside of how this isn't women's health being pathologized, no matter who's doing it. If it's a women's health expert that's doing it, or it's all infantilizing. Like, oh, poor you, you're feeling these things. And like, we better give you that epidural, or you better take that estrogen because you couldn't possibly feel good if you're, this and this are happening. And I've had really intense symptoms. I mean, I'm more intense than most of the people that I have spoken to, which really surprised me. So I'm not speaking as someone who had like no hot flashes or something. I've had years of hot flashes, years of being up at night, super intense vaginal pain, all kinds of things. And it doesn't last forever, just like puberty doesn't last forever. So I'm really interested in living this time.
Well, thank you for using your voice and for being willing to share a different perspective with women that perhaps are listening and going, yeah, you know what? I'm not really interested in taking hormone replacement therapy either. My mom's in her mid-60s, and I always joke when I'm on my cycle, I'm like, man, it must be nice to not have to deal with any of this anymore. And she's like, yeah, it is. She loves it. That's just one of many perspectives, I'm sure. But yeah, I really look forward to whatever you share and however you make sense of your experience. I'm sure it will be very beautiful and enlightening for all of us.
Thank you so much. I hope so.
Well, thank you for your time. And I will make sure to include all your information in the show notes. And how can people find or connect with you if you want to be found?
Yeah, you can go to KimberlyAnnJohnson.com. That's my website. You can go to mothercircle.com if you're interested in learning about mother circles. If you want to read the first chapter of my second book, Call of the Wild, for free, you can go to KimberlyAnnJohnson.com/chapter. That's really good if you're interested in the female nervous system, birth trauma, anything really nervous system related and women related.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share with friends and family and stay tuned for the next episode.